Welcome all to my conversation with Andrew Huddleston, who's a reader at Birkbeck College in London. Today we'll talk about his new book, his book that's upcoming, I think it's not yet out, on the highest calling of art and art as art and consolation. So Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for taking the time. If you could just maybe briefly summarize what the book's all about and what got you to write the book.
Well, the basic idea of the book is investigating this theme that's very prevalent from the turn of the 19th century into early modernism. And it's the idea that somehow art is going to take over for religion in the face of increasing secularism and what Nietzsche called the death of God. That art will somehow fill the spiritual void that is left behind by waning religion. And I look in the book at a number of ways that art thinks of itself as trying to do this.
And what is it that interested you in the first place in the topic?
Well, it's a combination of things, really. Partly, I think it's driven by a fascination with some of the works of art that have the ambition of trying to do this, and some of the artists who have the ambition of trying to do this. So people such as Wagner, paradigmatically here. But also because of the way that it's so entwined in the history of post-Kantian philosophy as well. The kinds of questions that occupy many of the most prominent post-Kantian philosophers are not the ones that we're most familiar with in Anglophone aesthetics, or at least there are considerable points of divergence. And this seems to me to be one of the most important strands of thinking in post-Kantian philosophical aesthetics, in figures such as the early German Romantics, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy, Heidegger, a number of others, Adorno, that where they see art as having important commonalities with the project of religion, which is, I think, something that's much less front and center in Anglophone philosophical aesthetics.
Yeah, why do you think that it's so prominent in the German Romantics, for example, or up until Heidegger, that it's very present, it seems, in on the continent, but maybe not so much in the Anglosphere?
Well, I mean, I guess I shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which it's absent in the Anglosphere. I think there are certainly figures in the Anglosphere who are part of this tradition, from people such as, the English Romantic poets, for instance, but up through Matthew Arnold and George Eliot, and then into the 20th century, people like I.A. Richards and Leavis. And there are lots of people in the Anglosphere, I think, who are interested in this too. I was thinking more in Anglophone philosophical aesthetics, as opposed to kind of just the Anglo world in general. And I think that has to do mainly with the way in which Anglophone philosophical aesthetics takes its cue from the kinds of questions that are most interesting to analytic philosophy, and then investigates those questions in the context of art. And there are lots of good philosophical questions there, of course, but this isn't something that is naturally fitting into that particular mold.
And in the book, so where does it begin? Does it begin with the German Romantics? And what would be the gist of the argument in general, perhaps?
Well, the way I have it set up is not as a chronological treatment by a particular school or particular figure. I have it organized instead by functions of religion. If we look at religion through a kind of anthropological lens, what are some of the things that religion is trying to do? And then I organized the book around some of those particular functions and thinking about how art has the ambition of trying to take up those same functions. So just by way of example, I talk about the ambition of trying to put us into contact with ultimate metaphysical reality. Yeah. And I think that's a theme that we see in a number of figures in this period, and something that religion is sometimes theorized as trying to do as well, put us in contact with the numinous or with ultimate reality in some way. And then the way that a chapter will be set up is I'll look at how that theme plays out across a few figures in a kind of theme and variation style. So I don't want to give an encyclopedic or an exhaustive treatment of the theme. I want to try to keep it more selective and focused, and with a particular eye toward working out what it would be for art to take over for religion, whether there could be any prospect of success, and if so, in what respects.
Yeah, and that's to me the most interesting question.
Mm.
What would it look like? What would it actually mean if art took over the, well, the function of religion or even the meaning of religion? And is there anyone you think who, of these thinkers that you consider, or artists you consider, who might have succeeded?
Well, I don't know if anyone's fully succeeded. I don't think it's really possible to fully succeed, given the kind of given the qualities that a religion would need to have. I think what we need to look to instead is what are some of the functions of it that people have tried to take up, and how successful have they been in taking up those functions? And I think depending on what the function is, art has been more or less successful at taking up some of these functions. Um, uh, but I don't think there are any cases where it's kind of taken over for religion successfully without remainder, without leaving something out or leaving something behind that one could very reasonably feel is lacking or missing. But I think on the flip side of that is there are potentially some ways that art could be an improvement over religion, taking up some of the same functions, but doing so without certain kinds of commitments, without certain kinds of baggage that might be in certain ways beneficial, even if there are trade-offs involved, even if some things are left behind.
So it's almost as if I understand you correctly, that artists and writers and philosophers at the time come in to fill the void that religion leaves behind when God dies, and
Mm-hmm.
the ensuing nihilism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and of course we know that Nietzsche was a bit disappointed with Richard Wagner's experiment there. And
Absolutely,
he
yes.
didn't think that he fully succeeded, but thought rather it was just a repetition or of a bourgeois entertainment or something.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. Yes, well, I think, Nietzsche has high hopes early on that Wagner's going to be able to do this. And you have that sort of enthusiasm present in The Birth of Tragedy and the dedication to Wagner in The Birth of Tragedy, and in some of the themes in The Birth of Tragedy, that Wagner will be able to present this mythology that's drawing on a wellspring of historical sources, but presenting it in a new way for an audience in the Germany of his time, and that it's going to play a role like the role that tragedy played in Attic Greece, that's going to bring people together, going to give them a kind of unifying narrative or mythology to understand their lives and see them as meaningful. And that's a very ambitious task for art to try to take up. But I think Nietzsche did have some optimism that Wagner would be able to do something like that. But then when he got to see the actuality of the first Bayreuth Festival in 1876, he thought that this was just a complete failure. And then I think he thought that Wagner went even further down a wrong path in focusing in particular on these Schopenhauerian themes of Mitleid, of pity / compassion in Parsifal, and going down a route that is, in Nietzsche's way of thinking, ethically problematic, picking up on what he sees as one of the most destructive and unhelpful aspects of religion, instead of on some of those aspects that might be life-affirming.
So those most destructive aspects of religion would be that they're life-denying, they're ascetic, and they deny the Dionysian, for example. Am I correct?
Yes, right. Just that they would be life-denying or life-negating. That they would stymie in a certain way creativity or flourishing. I think those were some of the concerns that Nietzsche had about this emphasis on compassion in Parsifal in particular. Nietzsche, of course, says it's a Christian work, which is a very contentious interpretation of it, and I think probably not how Wagner himself would have understood it. I mean, of course, it's a work that is about Christians, takes them as its subject matter, but whether it's a Christian work in the sense of giving voice to a doctrinaire Christian worldview, I think probably not. It's picking up on bits of this and that, bits of Schopenhauer, bits of Christianity, bits of Buddhism, and presenting them in its own way. And that was something Wagner was a master of doing. But I think Nietzsche thinks it's very ethically suspect.
Ethically suspect because it's still life denying ultimately, or life negating, and not
Yes.
affirming also of the destructive force that life also, or the kind of the exuberance of life, and which would have to be kind of, I think this is what he calls grand style, isn't it? The große Stil is where the Apollinian, so it's no longer a dialectic, but it's the Apollinian and the Dionysian, they're both allowed to take their course, as it were, and so somehow they're brought together by, I suppose, the Übermensch. Yeah.
Well, I think the picture Nietzsche has in The Birth of Tragedy is one where those two forces ideally need to be balanced against each other and integrated. And that's what he finds so impressive about Attic Greek tragedy, that those two artistic forces work together in a certain way. There's not one that's overpowering the other, but they're in a kind of interplay. And the artistic problems then come when we have the dominance of particularly the Apollonian over the Dionysian, but potentially the Dionysian over the Apollonian as well.
Yeah, then with Bataille.
Yes,
Some
indeed.
thought like that. So the interplay was interesting. I wanted to maybe, if you can, speak a bit about that. So the difference between Attic Greece tragedy, the proper birth of tragedy, and what then happens in the 19th century. What do you think are the differences? Why it doesn't flourish in the same way as it did in Greece? Why doesn't it work in Bayreuth as well? I mean, it was almost kind of the time was ripe. People were looking for something, but as Nietzsche says somewhere that I think it's in the Case contra Wagner, I'm not entirely sure. He says, he quotes an Italian lady as saying, si dorme così bene con questa musica, one sleeps so well with music, on Wagner. So yeah, what would be the differences, you think?
Yes, well, I mean, I think one question already at the beginning is the idea that this worked so well in Attic Greece already a kind of historical fantasy? And I think we can have some hypotheses about that, but we really don't know. I think a lot of what's going on in the 19th century is this very idealized image of the perfection of Attic Greece, and then an attempt to recreate that in a certain way. And it might be an overestimation of just how rosy things were and how successful this was at bringing people together. But I think that issue aside, one consideration is just the level of fragmentation in modern society compared with Attic Greece, at least as figures in this period would have thought about it and understood it. What we have in Attic Greece is the religion of the society coming together in an ideal way with the art that's being presented. These plays are offered as part of a festival to Dionysus. They're therefore integrated into the rites of religious worship, and also part of the political order as well. Something that's sanctioned by the polis. But what we have in the 19th century already with this idea of the death of God is this deep sense of fragmentation that religion and art have been torn asunder in a certain way, and a sense of course of political fragmentation in a variety of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the most relevant to the Bayreuth Festival is the idea that you are just having something that is Germany as a nation just around the time that the Bayreuth Festival is getting started. So you have lots of different political entities trying to unify themselves in a certain way.
Yeah.
In this period, but the very project of trying to do so is already suggestive of the sort of fragmentation that's in the background. That you're trying to forge a common identity precisely because it's lacking in certain ways, and there's, I think, considerably more focus if we're just thinking about the Athens, for instance,
Yeah.
as opposed to various kingdoms and principalities and what have you, brought together in Germany of the 1870s. So you have that fragmentation at the political level, and also the fragmentation at the religious level too, intersecting with the political fragmentation, because you have different religious denominations. Some parts where Catholicism is regnant, other parts where Lutheranism is regnant,
Yeah.
and trying to bring that together too in a certain way.
So kind of the bulwark against the wall that's being set up against this breaking away of meaning is already bears inherent problems, because you mentioned something that I found interesting, because you mentioned that it's predicated on a lack, on a perceived lack of meaning, and that reminded me, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but the romantics are usually, they begin from a stance of lack, right? That'd be fair to assume. So yeah, that would be, yeah. So that would perhaps also be the difference with Nietzsche then, and Wagner as kind of a late romantic or so also.
Yes, I think I hadn't thought about it in precisely those terms until you've put it this way just now. But it makes me think of that famous remark of Nietzsche's from The Gay Science, where he talks about whether superabundance or need has been creative here, the one, or operative here. You know the one I'm thinking about?
Yeah.
And thinking of that as a kind of metric to judge artistic expressions or creations. And here we have need as what is becoming operative. We have a sense of fragmentation politically, a sense of fragmentation religiously, socially, and then some countermeasure that is thought to remedy this. But maybe the difference with ancient Greece, at least in the idealized picture presented at this time, is that they were acting out of superabundance. They already had this, and this is just a celebration of what they already had, not something that's trying to repair, the nice term that you've added here, a lack.
Yes, I mean, I think it must have been, in the idealized version, of course, to be a Greek at that time, the question of meaninglessness, I don't think, arises. And it's just all rich with meaning. There's a wealth of superabundance. And out of that springs the appreciation of the Danon, the terrifying or the terrible, the most horrible, which then still can be, in the idealized version of the 19th century, retold, can still be, can be born, can be accepted, can be even affirmed, which the Romantics, I think, would not be able. I mean, my understanding of the Romantics is that, for example, when you look at Schlegel has Julian say that the only way one can live is in a vegetative state. Speaking of lack.
And interesting, of course, in the Romantics that you have fragmentation be celebrated in a certain way, which is there are different ways of thinking about that. But one way of thinking about it is you're kind of if this is what you're faced with, this is a kind of adaptive preference. That's maybe a somewhat a bit quick and unfair, but that would be one suspicion that you might have, that when people start celebrating fragmentation, that's a sign that they're stuck with that, and that they have an inkling that they can't do any better.
So where do you situate the romantics then in terms of the higher calling of art, to refer to your title?
Well, I think it varies with different figures.
Yeah.
So it's hard to generalize across all different figures. But for example, I talk about Novalis in connection with the metaphysical aspiration of art, this idea that it's going to put us in touch with the noumenal or ultimate reality. Because I think his ambition was that poetry would be able to do that.
Yeah.
How it would be able to do that is deeply mysterious, particularly because it is going to be operating at a conceptual level. And how do we, operating at this conceptual level, penetrate beyond, seemingly beyond the conceptual and get to ultimate reality? It's a great puzzle. But I think he's representative, one of the representative figures anyway, of this kind of ambition. So that would just be by way of example. I think we see a different sort of flavor if we're looking at Huddleston, for example.
Yeah.
There it's less about that kind of metaphysical aspiration. Now you see bits that go in different directions. But I think more about this theme, which you see in a number of other figures as well, of trying to create a mythology or come up with a mythology that is going to serve us now that the gods have flown. We're in the position that the gods have flown. What do we do in the face of this? And then then one of the ideas is, well, we need a mythology to give us meaning and direction in the face of the flight of the gods. And so this is this is another avenue that I think gets explored in early German Romanticism as well.
Yeah.
And of course, in the case of both of those figures, they are both theorizing, but also practically involved in the creation of artworks. So both poets themselves and writing works that are trying to do the thing that they're describing.
And of course, we can talk about Heidegger later, but he takes, of course, quite a bit from Hölderlin here, and this idea that the gods are, I think for Hölderlin, it's not so much that God has died, but that the divine has disappeared. There's a certain disappearance, but which of course kind of has a return inscribed in it too, if we properly respond to this call.
Yes. I think the images that he uses are interestingly different in that way, as you're indicating, from Nietzsche. So Nietzsche gives us these images of God dying, but the images that we get from Hölderlin are they've flown, or they've disappeared, or they're above us in some distant realm that we don't have any contact with them anymore. So suggesting that, exactly as you say, the possibility of their return, but suggesting their present distance from us.
Where is this something that you're a Nietzsche scholar, obviously. Is this something you've thought about, why or whence this disappearance of the divine comes in modernity, or why it is that God dies? There's so many stories to tell about this, but I always wonder what kind of narrative one would give to, because
I think it's a very difficult question, and the sort of thing where there's not one single story to be told. It's a lot of factors that are interacting here. Partly it's, I guess this is central part of Nietzsche's story. Partly it is the relentless will to truth. We're no longer able to just accept things on faith. We have to keep asking questions, and this strips us of all of our illusions, including and with that we have the divine evaporating or getting pushed aside, or exactly what image one wants to use. We have that happening as well. And it's connected. That is connected with the rise of the scientific worldview, and I think that's an important part of the story of secularization. or and there are various terms that are used for it: secularization, or disenchantment, or other sorts of synonyms. I think that's an important part of it, but there are other factors involved, and it's difficult to know exactly how they interact. I think another factor, for instance, is that kind of social and political fragmentation as well, that people don't have their sources of meaning as naturally in things outside of their smaller sphere, things that are collective at the social or political level, or at least that's diminishing the sense to which that's a source of meaning for people. What in turn explains that? I don't know, and the extent to which that's explanatory. Again, a difficult question, but I think that's part of the story as well. That people are finding meaning in things that are much more personal and local, in family and personal projects, and not in their relation to the cosmos, or even their relation to the polis. It's about my life, my family, my projects.
Yeah.
I think Nietzsche is an interesting diagnostician of this, because I think he thinks that's nihilism. That's down the path of nihilism.
Yeah.
If this is your sphere of meaning has contracted to this level. Whether he's right about that, I'm not sure. I mean, and a lot of us have what we think of as meaningful lives, and kind of triangulate our meaning from these more local things. But I think that's crucial to how Nietzsche's thinking about nihilism.
Yeah, that would be the last man, right?
Exactly. No, exactly. It's the last man.
It's very local, very much upon just the smaller units, but not the greater man that he hopes for. I wonder if in the book or in the project in general, does Goethe play any role?
I don't have him factored in the story yet.
Yeah.
I might, but I think, as with many worthy people who might be included, he probably will not be, just for reasons of space. I kind of pick, for a given chapter, 4 figures, perhaps, that I'm talking about. And then it means that there are lots of other people who could be part of this narrative who I just end up having to leave out. But I think he could be an interesting figure to include in a story like this.
Because he tried to give, or at least to poetize about what the curse of modern man is, right? If not,
yes,
yes, and also to turn his own life into a Gesamtkunstwerk.
Yes, I think that's an excellent theme, and it's actually one that I do treat in one of the chapters of the book. The idea of turning your life into a work of art as part of. I treat it under the banner of aestheticism, thinking about the 19th century movement of aestheticism, and this is one branch of it, trying to turn your life into a work of art. I have as my paradigmatic case here Oscar Wilde, but one could use Goethe as well, and various other figures too, possibly Nietzsche, possibly Proust. I mean, it depends, but I think Oscar Wilde makes for a nice one. I like his quip. I'm not sure if I'll get the wording exactly right, but you should either be a work of art or wear one.
I'm in full agreement. I do have a velvet sofa upstairs, so next time,
or sit on one. Yeah, there you go.
Yes, exactly. So next time we'll speak, I'll be on my velvet sofa, which is appropriate. You tell us more, maybe a bit about Oscar Wilde then, because he's a bit of a later figure than the others that we've discussed. So he's already seeing where modernity is leading, maybe more clearly than others.
Yes. So in this chapter about aestheticism, I talk about the idea that aesthetic values, where those are construed relatively narrowly, that these might be the source of higher meaning in life,
Mm-hmm.
and might in that way be a replacement for religious values.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in fact, this idea of a religion of art has often been conflated with that. It's one version of it, but it's just not the only version of it. And so these figures such as Oscar Wilde or Walter Pater, in a few active few decades before before Wilde, but overlapping somewhat. They, I think, of as paradigmatic representations of this aestheticist line. Aestheticism is very interesting here because, on the one hand, it's often described as a religion of art, but it's also born of the idea of art for its own sake, or art for art's sake, the emancipation of art from needing to be in the service of anything else, whether in the service of a church and a religious creed, or in the service in kind of high Victorian moralist style of expanding our moral sympathies toward our fellow human beings. They think, no, art is just about being beautiful and giving us pleasure and what have you. So I look at this particular strand in the chapter, talking about a variety of figures, but including centrally Walter Pater, who has a version of this aestheticist idea. Oscar Wilde, who has a version of the aestheticist idea, and connects both of them, connecting it in interesting ways with religion and the decline of religion. Oscar Wilde saying, for instance, that we need a confraternity of the faithless, and he has these wonderful quotations about how we need ritual in the aesthetic sphere that's detached from any of the particular apparatus of Christianity, but is still taking up the idea of ritual. So think about those two figures, and also think about Huysmans as well, in Au Rebours, where you have a kind of extreme of aestheticism portrayed in the main character of the novel, but also thereby a kind of critique of it. At the same time, it's a celebration in a certain way, a critique in a certain way. And that's emblematic of something that I try to do throughout the book project. I try to talk not just about how theories are engaged with by philosophers or artists when they're operating in the theoretical mode, but how works of art themselves take up and interrogate these particular questions. They aren't just examples of a religion of art.
Yeah.
They're also reflecting on the very idea of a religion of art and giving us further resources for thinking about that. And so in a number of chapters, I have works of art that I treat in detail, where I think they're both exemplifying it in a certain way, exemplifying this trend of a religion of art, but also critically interrogating it. So talking about, in that chapter, I talk about Huysmans. In the chapter on Consolation, I talk about Rilke and his Duino Elegies, and about Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus. In another chapter about the sacred, I talk about some figures in later 20th century art who take up are interrogating in certain ways ideas of the sacred. So thinking of Andy Warhol in this connection.
Really?
I think a very interesting figure in this connection.
Yeah.
Thinking about Francis Bacon,
Mm-hmm.
who of course will present some of his works in what is a conventional religious format of the triptych, but in a way that's kind of through a refracted in a way where you're totally at a distance from anything that seems like it would be a religious worldview. And with Warhol, this fascination with icons and iconicity, and in a number of other respects as well. So I have a variety of figures. So those are just examples of writers and artists who are reflecting on these ideas, challenging these ideas, while having, in some cases, a degree of admiration for them, but ambivalence about them. And I like to reflect on those figures.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about, actually a lot now.
Mm.
I wouldn't have thought that Warhol and Francis Bacon will be mentioned, but you mentioned them, if I heard you rightly, that they are connected to a certain sense of the sacred.
Yes, at least reflecting on the idea of it and
Okay.
art's role in it. So I have a
Yeah.
chapter that's about the sacred and the way that the sacred gets, attempts to recreate the sacred get taken up artistically. So talking about the idea of aesthetic experience as itself a kind of sacral moment, and thinking about Wachenroder in this connection, talking about the attempt to create particular places that will be ideal for the experience of the sacred, and thinking about, in that connection, figures such as Wagner paradigmatically creating the Festspielhaus, or Mark Rothko creating the Rothko Chapel in Houston, and having that be a sacred space. But also talking about, and this is where figures such as Warhol come in, talking about the interrogation of the idea of the sacred and playing with the idea of the sacred. Because it, on one way of looking at him, he's the kind of ultimate celebrator of the profane. That's really his artistic project. He's the person who's going to present as a work of art the thing
Yeah.
that we would buy in the grocery store.
Yes.
And have in the gallery something that looks like it's a Brillo box. And so it seems like the ultimate celebration of the profane. But on the other hand, there is this fascination that he has with religious themes throughout his work, I think, um, um, where the icon is maybe the most central of those ideas. But it gets treated in what I think is a very interesting way, because on the one hand, there's this sense of profanity in the way that he presents the icon. So they're not going to be the conventional religious figures. He's going to give you Marilyn Monroe or Chairman Mao or
Yeah.
whoever it is, and really highlighting the mass-produced quality of this thing, of a silk screen or whatever it may be, but at the same time evincing a continuing sense that we need someone, even if they're celebrities, to
Yeah.
occupy this place. So it can be a sign that we've descended, on one way of looking at it, a sign that we've descended so far into a certain kind of nihilism that
Yeah.
the only people who could occupy this place are Marilyn Monroe and whoever else it may be, Chairman Mao.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think this lingering sense of the sacred. And Warhol himself was he was raised in the Byzantine rite of Catholicism, so kind of the Eastern Rite Catholicism,
Mhm.
where icons play a very big role. So he grew up with all of this stuff, and continued to go to services, which this was all the while that he was doing these avant-garde things in New York at the factory and what have you. He was going to these Catholic church services at the same time, and had a shrine in his apartment that had religious icons on it. Mixed in, of course, with all the kitsch and other stuff that he collected in the apartment. But it's, I think, these fascinating dimensions of his personality are melded together. So I think he's a very interesting figure for thinking about the way these ideas echo. I call the chapter Echoes of the Sacred. So it's, and those echoes are stronger in certain cases and fainter in certain cases. And in some of the cases, they're being reflexively interrogated, and I think that that's true in the Warhol case, or in the case of another figure I talk about, Andres Serrano, who had the very controversial, is most famous for the controversial work called Immersion, then in parentheses Piss Christ, which is the photograph of a crucifix that's submerged in urine, that was the topic of tremendous culture wars in the 1990s in the US about funding, with some conservatives saying, you know, how could we possibly give money from the National Endowment for the Arts to fund this kind of degeneracy? But Serrano identifies as a Christian and says that this work is a reflection on the torments to which Christ was subjected. And you look at this work and you see it having a kind of, the way he's photographed it, it has this kind of otherworldly glow to it, kind of goldish orange glow that makes it seem like Christ is triumphing over this adversity. So it's another fascinating work to think about how these ideas of the sacred continue to get reflected on in 20th late 20th century art.
So that maybe there's something then on that narrative, on that story, then perhaps that art must to some degree always reflect on the sacred. Not all art, but to some degree, not all
Possibly
art, I'm saying,
so,
but
yes. I mean, I think that there is some art that just tries resolutely to refuse this. You know, I think we can think of some kinds of pop art that with which Warhol's associated, of resolutely trying to refuse this.
mm-hmm.
And the range of other works that just, they don't want to have any truck with this, these lingering vestiges of theology.
Mm-hmm.
And there are various ways of retreating away from it. But I think one idea that I am persuaded by is that, I'll couch it somewhat cautiously, it's that most of the best art has always been an engagement with in some respect or other, with religion broadly conceived. And I think that's right. I mean, it's certainly right as a historical hypothesis, because so much of the art that was produced before several hundred years ago was for a religious or in a religious context.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even after that, there are ways in which the best art continues to be an engagement in some way or other with these lingering religious themes.
And also a possibility for consolation, as in your chapter on Rilke.
Yes. Because I think that that's another one of these functions of religion, to
mm-hmm.
provide a kind of existential consolation in the face of suffering and death. And art steps in to try to fill that role as well. So it's not just about giving us an entertaining or a pleasant experience. It's about trying to speak to these deep concerns that we have as mortal beings.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many works of art that try to do that. It's hard even to know where to begin. But what I look to in that chapter is some reflections in post-Kantian philosophy on tragedy, and the way in which tragedy can participate in this enterprise of existential, or in Nietzsche's term, metaphysical consolation, and then look at some reflections on this idea, and also attempts in a way to perform it in Rilke, and in more reflections, not attempts to perform it, in Dr. Faustus, reflections on the idea of art and consolation. So in this chapter, as in the others, there's so many figures one could talk about, and I just try to focus on a few representative examples that are in a certain sort of dialogue with each other.
Maybe say a few words about Rilke and about the 10 elegies and how far they offer consolation to their readers.
Yes, well, I think the first thing to say about them, and the first reason that I pick them in this context, is that they are works that, as a number of the commentators have observed, have a kind of meta-poetic dimension. So they're reflecting on the task of poetry itself. At the same time, they are are presenting poetry. So it's a particularly good case to think about in this respect, because you have both the attempt through poetry to give a certain kind of consolation, and the reflection on that very process itself. Now, as for the kind of consolation that I think is on offer in the Duino Elegies, as I read it, it focuses on the idea that we need to transform our affective orientation toward the world. So it's very much growing out of the interest that Rilke had in Nietzsche, and in some of these ideas from Nietzsche, and in the thought that we need to take what is difficult and find some way of affirming it, where that's more than just uttering yes to it, but having our affects be transformed toward it, so that we come to love it, and to see what's good in it. And I think that this is what the Duino Elegies tries in such a tremendously ambitious way to do with finitude and death. It takes something that is tremendously difficult and tries to affectively reorient us in such a way that this is something that we can give our affirmation to, give our full-blooded affirmation to. And that is, as I say, a tremendously ambitious idea. But I think that that's what's both described in the Duino Elegies, but also what it attempts to enact in a certain way. Maybe even more clearly in the Sonnets to Orpheus, attempting to enact this kind of affirmation, the emphasis there on praising. The task of the poet is praising. But I think it's in the Duino Elegies too. And in the Duino Elegies, we have this meta-level reflection on it that makes them particularly interesting for including in my project.
Yeah, so you mentioned that it's actually that he thinks through some of Nietzsche's ideas. He mentions the bow in the first elegy, I think, which is of course a reference to Nietzsche, whether we are under so much tension in modernity, we finally have to kind of, the bow has to leave the arrow has to leave the bow, sorry, and try and find its new place. And then you mentioned a transformation, so we can almost see Heidegger was very taken by Rilke. The story goes that when he was a young lecturer in Marburg, his students, among them Gadamer, told him about Rilke, and apparently Heidegger had never heard of Rilke.
Really, I didn't know that.
Within a week he read all of Rilke, and then the next seminar, the next Friday, was very brutal about it. So the transformation of the human being, and then there's something else that you pointed out, which I think is extremely crucial to understand, is it's the modern subject, the modern human being, has to deal with death in a way that perhaps not many before had to deal with death. There's zero consolation left. I mean, you can kind of get to transhumanistic visions of the cloud being uploaded, which is new Christianity. We both have had experiences of people talking about this, right? So we don't have any religious consolation when it comes to death and dying and loss, this fundamental loss, right? And then you get to someone like Heidegger, who literally says in some of the more esoteric works in the 1940s, he says, we mustn't reduce death to a passage, but we must think death purely as death. It's really quite, brutal, to be honest. But Rilke tries to, and of course with Heidegger, and we can get to that, there's after the war, he talks about the community of mortals and building, dwelling, thinking of mortals coming together as mortals, those who are capable of death as death, whatever that's supposed to mean. But yeah, so in Rilke, maybe you could say a bit more about this, this tension of this moment in which we are, where death really is something we would have to face up to.
Yeah, well, that's a very good observation of yours about the continuity between Rilke and Nietzsche on the bow image, the one we get at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil in Nietzsche, and then in the first elegy, and the sense that something is important about the tension remaining in the bow, and I think that definitely is a key point of commonality in those figures. So on the kind of consolation that we're that Rilke thinks we're to find,
Mm-hmm.
I think that it will involve these kinds of epiphanic moments when we, aided by poetry, look on this worldly
Mm-hmm.
and see it in a certain way, see it as something that is transient, yes, but something that is transformed by our love of it and our concern for it. And there are amazing passages where he talks about the poet's task being to just speak these ordinary things, and that's what the angel can gain from the poet. This
Mm-hmm.
insight into the ordinary human world that is transformed
Mm-hmm.
by our love of it and our attachment to it, even though it's transitory.
So the ordinary, the everyday, becomes the focus and more a source of meaning or beauty even than, for example, in this, well, dreamy fantasy of a Wagnerian world.
Yes, or indeed at the other great extreme, the beyond, as conceived in the more metaphysical versions of this idea of art religion. So there, the idea is that we are redeemed by getting in contact with some ultimate noumenal reality. And I think the idea in Rilke is quite the opposite. It's that we need to get rid of that transcendent aspiration, the aspiration that we need to rise beyond this world and get to another one. What we have to see is the beauty and majesty in this transitory world. And that's a very difficult task, particularly when we're faced with this very palpable sense of its finitude. But he has just such beautiful images to convey this idea. That we have it, this idea, I think, especially developed from the 7th through the 10th elegies. That there's going to be this epiphanic sense of earthly existence, and then by the 9th elegy, a kind of statement of what the poetic task will be, involving this. And then in the 10th, those wonderful closing lines where he gives us these images of the catkins on the bare hazel trees, or on the of the raindrops that are falling on the dark earth in springtime, and invites us to see in these images, which are images of falling, not images of rising, images of falling, something something that we want to affirm. And he closes by saying that we who have always thought of happiness as something that is rising, thinking of steigendes Glück, we are going to be bowled over by seeing a happy thing fall. So in this way, completely inverting this Platonic Christian aspiration, that what we need to do is to ascend away from the earthly and the transitory and get to some kind of numinous beyond, saying instead that it's in those things that are transitory, those things that are falling, that we find our kind of our form of redemption. But it's actually curious how much ambivalence there is. It's one of the reasons I like Rilke as an example so much. How much ambivalence there is in those final lines. It's phrased as a kind of conditional or as a question, not as a definitive statement, which I think is fascinating. the way he does it. It's, if we can get ourselves
Yeah.
into such a position that we would see that,
Hmm.
then we would find a kind of redemption. But will we be able to? Who knows?
Yeah, but he couldn't answer that, right?
He couldn't. No.
Yeah. It must be open. I think the 20th century is one question mark in some of this. Being in time ends on a question mark. Is
I
time
didn't
a
know that.
horizon of being? Right?
Oh, yes, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, you mentioned the earth coming into the earth, more further to the earth, away from the sky. For Heidegger, the later Heidegger, as you know, it's towards the earth, and the sky is it's the place of divinities, but it's ultimately also a limit for mortals. It's not to be, it's not reachable for
Yes.
us mortals.
Yes, no, it's a great idea. There should be a book written. There probably already is. Many of them about great works of the 20th century that end in question marks.
Yeah.
I think the Magic Mountain should be at the top of this list too. That ends in a question mark, with the same kind of imagery drawn upon, about whether out of this world festival of death, love will one day rise. And it just ends with that question.
Yeah.
I think there is something very distinctive about about works of the 20th century, that there is that kind of openness that it makes sense to end with question mark.
Yes, I mean, this is of course for us the question then, right? In the 21st century, what kind of works will be written now, and will they end with an exclamation point, or will we finally let go of the arrow and
an emoji, maybe emojis with the an emoji.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah.
Or a GIF perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's hope not. It's upon perhaps. No, please not. But yeah, so I think because I've seen the chapter before, that's why I can say as much. On the chapter on Heidegger, or on Wagner as well. I think it's on art as forming a community. Maybe that's also something that's crucial to end this conversation on, and how far these figures, or any that you'd like to focus on, really see art as a way of forming a proper community, which I think is in a response to the fragmentation of society.
Yes.
Also.
Yes. Well, in that chapter which you're mentioning, those figures, Wagner and Heidegger, are two of the main examples that I'm looking to, and both of them, I think, have ambitions that art will be able to bring a fragmented community together and reveal to it in a symbolic fashion what its deepest values are, in a way that gives that community meaning. Now, whether that's actually possible, I don't know. I think that there are works of art that have the ambition of trying to do that, but it's difficult to know what the relevant community is supposed to be in these works. Who is the we, or who is the us in these works? I mean, do you have thoughts about who that is in Heidegger's case? Who is he thinking the relevant community is?
So when we think of the origin of the work of art, I think he speaks of the Greeks. And the Greeks as a possibility, and because that's one of his main examples is the Greek temple, and then his other example is the pair of what he thought was peasant shoes by Vincent van Gogh. And of course, I think what he turns to is perhaps the rural communities, the village communities. Yes, much more than anything in the cities. Right around the same time in 1935, when he writes that essay, I think he also writes a short piece, which is Why We Stay in the Provinces. Because he was invited by the NSDAP to lecture in Berlin early on, when Hitler came to power, and he didn't want to go there. But I think, it's the rural communities, but it's also kind of an admission that this is now no longer possible, because we live in an epoch of representation. So when we see, he says something like, the god Apollo or Zeus, the statue is the god, and I think he the ist is in italics. Right? It's just stressed that
Yes.
this is the God. It's not a representation of the
It
God,
is the God.
but it
Yes.
is the God.
Mm-hmm.
And but weirdly enough, after the war, Heidegger turns to artists like Chihida,
Mm-hmm.
right? Who's what is it? Abstract, abstract sculpture, and
Mm-hmm.
sees in abstract sculpture, so totally different from kind of an
Mm-hmm.
idealized version of a 19th century idea of what the Greeks were supposed to be like.
Mm-hmm.
Chihida is someone who breaks open or totally dismantles any kind of representation. Heidegger sees in Chihida, for example, that actually here you see that space isn't the absolute space of physics. And the art becomes for Heidegger later on a lot less about community, but much more about breaking, sort of showing that the rules of physics aren't as all powerful as they seem to be, or that there is something else in space, which is place comes first. So he's there's I think important a new direction after the war with Heidegger, and then what he's gathered around is death. But
yeah, but I think I agree with you, I guess, about the on the origin of the work of art. I mean, it has a kind of ambivalence in it about the possibility of building such a community today. Looking back to the past and seeing how the temple could gather people together to it in a certain way, and then the juxtaposition is with the contemporary period, where that's going to be far more difficult and maybe impossible. You could attempt it, but is it going to do anything like at least the idealized vision of what that could do in the past? And then you have these, particularly in the writings about poetry, formulations that make it seem like the best we can do is do things such as attend singing to the trace of the fugitive gods, which makes it seem like, no, we're not building a community. We're just, getting a little touch of that thing that we can't really capture anymore. That's the best we can hope for.
Yes, and that's the best one can hope for if one is a member of the few and rare, as right? So this the Hölderlin for Heidegger becomes someone who I think this is almost a direct quote, poetizes the furthest ahead. So it's all about thinking ahead, because this now is so dreadful that all the few and rare can do is carry on the torch of the extinguished fire and hope that one day again there will be, meaning will make a return. It's almost like this a tidal movement, and currently we're living through this ebbing, flowing away of meaning. And in such a time that there is no community, there is simply just this dissolution or dissolvement of what once was. But then, of course, he's ever still a Nietzschean, right? The law of eternal recurrence.
Yes. Well, it's why I think Wagner and Heidegger make such a good pairing in this respect, or a good point of juxtaposition, because Wagner is someone who has a number of the same commitments, but is much more ambitious about their realization. And then in Heidegger, you have some of the same ideas about community, at least as kind of normative ideals, but very little optimism about the capability of their present fulfillment. And what we need is a kind, just for those, as you're saying, for those few, something that is very much a second best, but it's the best we can do.
Yes, and for Heidegger, death is what becomes death is where a community gathers round, weirdly, right? After the war, is that we must become mortals, and then we can begin again to build, dwell, and think that all goes together. And in his writing on poetry, one of them, of course, is "What are poets for in desolate times," which is a quote from Hölderlin, but then it's a piece on Rilke mostly.
Yes. And that is, I think, where that quotation about attending singing to the trace of the fugitive gods is in that essay, right? Yeah.
And it's also connected again to death, right? That the other side of being is death, and death is always already kind of is the law of being. So you get these, it's this kind of facing up to mortality that then could give rise later on to a return of meaning.
Yes, yes. I think it's as with many of these chapters, I could have a number of fruitful juxtapositions,
Yeah.
and another would be the Rilke Heidegger commonalities, particularly on this idea of death as something that needs to be embraced, and that there could potentially be a kind of community built around that. But so many different avenues to explore.
Yes.
Hmm.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the great questions.
Thanks. It was very good. Thanks.